folks, when I was asked to do this discussion, I was interested in thinking about participation and the way in which computer games can be said in a certain way to develop kinds of participation that are not part of the standard engineering of their, or part of their standard design. That is, how different forms of participation can emerge in computer games that are both designed and part of their procedure, but also how there's a mode of pluralistic interpretation of participation that happens around different computer games. So this object that we're looking at here is one of the ones that I think is a really good example of this kind of condition. It's Twitch Plays Pokemon, and it's a video streaming service involving tens of thousands of people playing a very old computer game on Nintendo Game Boy emulator all at the same time. So you have simultaneously tens of thousands of people all playing a highly simple, rudimentary game from the 1980s. And I'll explain that towards the end of the talk, but I just wanted to kind of set out a kind of framework for thinking about participation in computer games that is slightly at a tangent to fully engaged participation. So participation that's slightly more daydreamy or kind of dawdling than the participation that we see as kind of fully energized integration into a cultural industrial object. So I'm going to read a paper around this. So as a child, I could get quite seriously interested in computer games, believe their imperatives, become enraptured by their proprioceptive experience, and get that simultaneously annoyed and excited sense that this is all that matters, and that ends in tantrums. Growing up in Warwickshire, of course, there's not much else to do. This childhood, of course, lasted quite a bit longer than the biological one. Nowadays, however, since much of working life is full of things that are approximately like games or have some of the same underlying machinic aspect, I have less enthusiasm and less need to be locked into a set of animated imperatives. One can take emails, for instance, as merely a different representational form of combative monsters in a first-person shooter, needing different moves and key combinations, while sometimes requiring painful processes of acquisition to see them off. Perhaps responding to such a condition, there's a genre, casual gaming, for games designed for jaded souls. The term describes phenomena such as Candy Crush, games that you pull out whilst on the bus, games to enjoy and to fidget with. The games are trivial and essentially about a relationship between instant gratification and the potential build-up of something more pressing, the drive to potentially really win, with the machinic imperative lurking just underneath. There's something like a cigarette, a real electronic one. Games such as Clash of the Clans that work heavily with operant conditioning techniques to keep the user itching for a little more, a little update, exemplify this condition of the phone or tablet operating as a replacement for the cigarette. But even these are too much hard work, too much like answering emails. My gaming experience is now more daydreamy in a way, something like being a backseat driver who doesn't say much. I like to watch the screen while other people play. Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto, Assassin's Creed, open world games like Minecraft that are quite filmic, but that don't have the imperative that you care about the depth of the plot or the characters in the way that you're supposed to if you watch an actual film or television. The work of caring too much about plot is tedious. But films with cars zooming around and explosions happening can be quite good. In a sense, the experience is like some relatively plotless avant-garde procedural in which the simple movement of the characters moving around in a space changes the information that you see and induces responses and trivial interactions from non-player characters. The scripts of non-player characters are always fascinating, and the extent to which their text is loaded with supposed clues, prompts to further action, or effective instructions, or is the work of some chatbot generating something like a fragment of the hubbub of a Renaissance town or a quasi-Viking village? A relation to landscape can be like this too. One can see entities moving around on screen in a way that reveals terrain. But being computer games, such terrain always involves something like a puzzle based around Boolean logic. There's an incipient Zelda in each of them. Even in the most ostensibly open world, something is there to trigger some kind of action with a yes or no function. You need to identify it, figure it out, carry out the correct operation with it, and it always requires only one kind of interaction, only one way of getting it right. And this is the thing I can't be bothered with. Such things are too much like trying to get the fill function right in a multi-field form in a writable PDF in which there's a hidden control for the number of characters. It's never that easy, or more accurately, interesting. A good game in this sense is a bit like mushroom picking, where the experience of the space is highly nuanced and detailed, exciting, but not quite determinant, and in the main, fairly pointless. I like to watch someone playing a game where they take a certain enjoyment in doing something very seriously, but lightly against the imperatives of the game. For instance, someone who just likes driving around luxury cars in Grand Theft Auto and takes a delight in moving from a Lamborghini to a Maserati for no particular reason, just to enjoy the abundance of them, that a Bugatti Veyron is as lightly as a pickup truck. There's a kind of sub-manic futility that's pleasant to be infected by, that has something in common with much of the pleasures of contemporary life. Pedigree dog shows, shelves of highly specialized kitchen gadgets that are hymns to the futility of order and efficiency, but that still find themselves in a remainder shop and that thus seem like a lament to a lost imagined world where efficiency would be slightly different. Fashion blogs, bumbling about, enthusiasms building up and dying out, crazes, buzzwords, hyper-concentrated knowledge of trivia, the fabulous jargons accreted in specialized fields of knowledge. Things that are complex enough to fill your attention, but that can be rinsed out of consciousness almost immediately, though with the chance of perhaps a few moments of micro-nostalgia for them as the enthusiasm wanes, and one wonders whether such an effect is simply the half-life of a mediatic hormone working its way through the metabolism, rather than any special relation to the half-remembered thing. That is to say that the watching of interlocking of different imperatives, those of the terrain and of the game, and of the interest of the person, is part of a wider condition of drifting, irritation, gratification, and micro-interest in some mechanical novelties that become modes of life that in turn games articulate extremely well. And this enthused, slightly buzzy but dozy neutrality is a bit useless in the world of game studies, in which a first point of accreditation is to be a gamer who cares and who plays ardently. There is a rite of passage aspect to such work, an authenticity test, at which I'm unfortunately, as in the games themselves, an early loser. To some extent, the critiques of the intellectualization of games as experienced by non-gamers echo those of the non-committed. There's a certain Stalinist authenticity to proper gamers, whose enthusiasm is conversely marked by the bite of their bitterly apolitical nature, as evidenced in the Gamergate events. The idea that one doesn't have to do sufficient work of concentration care, as you might were you to watch a soap opera, a reality TV show, or a film, is perhaps an affront to those who do make the effort to do the hard cognitive work. After all, there's an abundance of stuff going on, all the work of design going into non-player characters, spaces, objects. It's an insult to not use it well, that is, according to the script. But all that work aimed at making the thing a certain kind of real sustains a partial but not enrapturing entertainment, which has a certain Cantorian infinity of detail work that's fascinating and deranging at the same time. What might be the case, however, is that this condition of exploring the game as a field of potentialities that's slightly tangential to, but not entirely opposite to the imperatives of the operation reward structure of the game, is crucial to the game as a form of culture. It may indeed be that the most successful and interesting games accommodate this dawdling, non-functional and daydreamy condition. Here, a number of things can become interesting. One is that with a realistic game, the crassness of the model of the external world that the game provides, for obvious reasons of computational and labour limits, even in a narratively and structurally self-consistent game world, the repetitiveness and laboriousness of some of the routines required provide some of the conditions of experience of the game. Following this, in many artistic uses of computer games as environment, deliberately wrong behaviours are explored as a means of reflecting on the way in which the game models life and the operation reward structures built into it. Equally, exploration of glitches, such as the spaces internal to characters, as in Jodi's work using Max Payne or Quake in the early 2000s, where they open up visually and procedurally interesting nooks and crannies in a game, and the way that unseen elements, such as invisible polygons, form around a character which operate to govern collision detection. And there are other less meticulous explorations of such a condition. In Skyrim 2, for instance, a horse crossing a bridge visually does something like wading through it, as if it were breasting a river. There's a relief from the kind of relentlessly effective, if not entirely convincing, operations of the apparatus. Bethesda Games, the company that makes Skyrim, have a certain form here, with bugs that also excite a crop of findings with each new release. People get interested in such conjunctures, glitches, in a related way to that in which they might develop a sentimental attachment to certain minor processes in a word processor, or the specific qualities of a config file. There's a sense of malleability here, as if in a Wittgensteinian language game, there were little pockets in which other language games crop up and maybe provide a wormhole through to another condition. The artistic exploration of these pockets, these interference patterns, is a means of attending to the multiple nesting of different ordering and representational mechanisms, and how these may at times jump scale, fold each other inside out. A related sense of this overly passive enjoyment of things that are valorized for their high degree of interactivity and participation is the massive field of Let's Play videos on YouTube and other such platforms. Here, gamers play a game and provide a running commentary on it as they do so. The screen shows what they see as a player and footage of their face in an insert. Part of the pleasure of these videos is a sense of playing alongside them. Some Let's Plays tend towards the rather mechanical exercise of virtuosity, telling the viewer what they intend to do and then doing it. Others are more playful, involving meandering chit-chat about the world along with commentary on the game, and some of the most known players belong to this kind, figures such as Stampy or PewDiePie. Any of you who've got kids will probably be overly familiar with their voices. The game may become the opportunity for banter, the highly valued, witty but ostensibly inconsequential commodified chat that's become a discreetly branded mode of speech in the present. Banter, though, its ostensive meaninglessness, is of course where a lot of questions of orientation, of parody, of inversion and reinforcement of norms gets played out as a form of linguistic operations of games physics. In Let's Plays, it is usually accomplished by a degree of expertise in the game. Such videos may also be watched for straightforwardly informational purposes, alongside videos that show a viewer how to get past a particular stage in a game. What Let's Plays point towards is that video games have become a sufficiently embedded and complex part of culture that they are pluralistic, open to different modes of interpretation, where different modes of belief, use, and imaginary operate and coexist, whilst operating within the same or overlapping sets of resources. The tangential reading is, perhaps perplexingly, fully constitutive of this condition. Alongside this movement of reading games at a tangent to their axiomatic form, we can say that there is also another mode of approaching the game that is to address it as a single, self-consistent artifact, rather than as a space to be explored. And this is an approach that's exemplified particularly in some of the archival work around computer games as ways of archiving the game. A number of techniques take this angle. Speedrunning is an approach in which the fastest route through every level of a game is memorized and programmatically enacted by a gamer. It results in extraordinary feats, such as the completion of Sonic the Hedgehog in 2.5 hours. Alternate kinds of runs, such as those resulting in finding all resources and killing all monsters, are also used. Relatedly, there are feats of automatic completion of gameplay in displays of deep learning algorithms, where the moire effect of one batch of rule sets interacting with another produces the effect of intelligence, with AI software over time learning to play. An example of this is Google DeepMind running some software that learned how to play and beat all Atari games. A claim made here is that machine learning technology is able to evolve novel approaches to gameplay, signifying something that, given certain constraints, maps across to intelligence. So we can think about the relationship between machinic structures and participation as perhaps signifying intelligence in a certain way. Thirdly, there are approaches that set out to map the entire state space of a game. Californian researcher Jeremy Douglas's mapping of all permutation of a set of games, and the artist group Jody's rendering of the ZX Spectrum game Jet Set Willy, both treat the game as a single computational object in this way. Both spatialize the results in large mapping diagrams. Aside from these very different approaches, which gain traction on a game due to their reasoned measures, it seems there's room for a Monsieur Hulot or Mr. Bean character to inhabit games with a bemused and affable or confused and frustrated persona of interaction. Such an entity would not act out of intelligence defined according to rational achievement of goals, but rather by the purloining of the figure of intelligence by other drives: curiosity, the generative powers of stupidity or clumsiness, the power of confusion as a form of interest. Misinterpretation here becomes a multiplier of meaning. Misidentification of the world, freeing the player up to accrete a non-unified identity. This space of constitution is an awkward but fecund relation to the world, is also a space in which economic value is generated out of the entropy that is conditional on meeting axiomatic form. One of the ways of working such an aesthetics is to look at the ways in which the debate around the procedurality of computational culture arises. The formation of the discussion in electronic literature and in game studies in debates around the term procedure, for instance in the work of Janet Murray, Michael Matthias, Noah Wardrip-Fruin, and Espen Aarseth, anticipates some of the concerns around algorithms that appear more recently in the social sciences and elsewhere. Here we can say that the different debates in the different disciplines or fields take on different forms. In the social sciences, there's an enthusiasm for the algorithm as an explanatory factor that passes in a certain way as a means of refounding a revised social physics of a variant kind to that promulgated by Quetelet. A physics of mechanics and its dream of policy that's coded and directly implementable, simply because they're demonstrably operative. This social physics of algorithms operates in a world where the atomistic and probabilistic thermodynamic physics of Boltzmann and those who came after him comes to the fore by comparison, as a grounds for the interpretation of the social. Here, it can be argued, and aesthetics is fundamental. It's necessary too, not simply for the fine and rare formulations of mathematical processes as they intersect with other scales of the world, but also for the lumpy, coagulated, and thickly fleshy aspects and entities of the world, and the way it's munged together in software systems. In such a regard, the discussion of procedure in electronic literature and games provides a way of thinking such terms as experiential, as something that is found most intensely in the middle of an ongoingness. One of the most precise of such formulations is that of process intensity proposed by game designer Chris Crawford, who says, process intensity uses the ratio of operations per datum, which I call the crunch per bit ratio. I intend here that an operation is any process applied to a datum, such as an addition, subtraction, logical operation, or a simple Boolean inclusion or exclusion. A datum in this scheme can be a bit, a byte, a character, or a floating point number. It's a small piece of information. Process here is a synonym for the textual aspect of the algorithm, an effective procedure, in some respects, but it's also at another level for mathematical and logical forms, partially realized as algorithms, and also those in other states as they operate in relationship to hardware, as programs, or as ordered data. Crawford notes, for instance, that a table of data can be used to affect the operation of an algorithm or procedure in memory-constrained computers. So the pertinent data structure also has its role in generating the nature of the experience of a game. As Ian Bogost writes in his noted discussion of process intensity of games, some such games may indeed allow for a kind of exploration, since they create a space in which multiple threads of programming are underway. Indeed, he remarks, game assets themselves, in their visual or sonic unfolding, may be highly processual. A game can be said to emphasize the interaction of multiple processes, to embody sustained complexity, as opposed to an approach that emphasizes data or the display of game assets. In this condition, the more a game acts as a place in which variation can be experienced and structurally and imminently operated on and in, the better it is. This given, then, I want to look at two examples of games that exemplify certain aspects of the interrelation of both dawdling, that is, this kind of absent-minded, tangential use of games or experience of games, and the way in which process intensity provides an analytical framework to understand them. Here, it should be noted that the two are not entirely mutually exclusive, not fully overlapping. In some cases, dawdling may be immune from process intensity. In other cases, it may be fully process intense, depending on the structure of the game and what counts as an event within it. Agar.io, which is not the one on the screen, but I'll describe it, is a deceptively simple online game that involves moving a colored dot around on a two-dimensional gridded plane of other smaller or larger variously colored dots that are also moving. A user drags or pushes the dot around using a trackpad or mouse on a tablet or a phone. The regime of accumulation that the game makes explicit is that larger dots eat smaller dots and thus become bigger. Each sprite is a target for others, and each must eat in order to mitigate against depletion. There are a few glosses on this and niceties of tactics, such as the ability to spit out part of your dot to devour another, or the game's placement of obstacles called viruses on the playing space that break up a larger dot into numerous smaller ones, thus creating a certain kind of spatial tactics of accumulation. To follow Crawford's model of process intensity, Agar.io is relatively process intense. There are a few graphic assets in the game, and gameplay involves moving around, avoiding, and eating. What can perhaps be added then is that the concomitant of process intensity is a certain ability to modulate such intensity by behavior, to slacken it, to goof off, and to dawdle. Algorithmic dawdling that has the process as a coefficient, something that is constituent of it and that continues to unfold along with it, but to which it is not entirely reducible. Process intensity, then, is something that both models high-efficiency gaming, but also provides a means of assaying the more dawdling mode of play. In such games, indeed, much of the processuality of the game is generated by the gamers and their interaction in the relatively simple space that it establishes. We should note, however, that each game would have its own conditions. Dawdling play might be more or less process intense, depending on the kind of operations being carried out in the game. So to describe the game in simply algorithmic or procedural terms, assuming one brackets out those of the operating systems, browsers, networks, and other structures that set it up, would be possible. Such an inventory would include laying out the dots to be eaten, movement and inertia, collision detection, accumulation of the mass of a dot, tracking of time online and other data around gameplay, updating the information of all players in the same game space. To put it bluntly, this is a relatively small set of processes. The amount of data operated on is also concomitantly small. Much of the work of the game is achieved in frameworks and systems that are independent of it and within which it interoperates and relies upon. The game thrives on its simplicity and the way in which players are able to generate the active nature of the gameplay because of the way in which it can bring together a small cluster of processes amidst a larger scale aggregate of procedures. Another way of saying this is that in this case, algorithmic processes are simply parts of a wider mix, and critical attention brought to bear upon them needs to recognize the wider assemblages of which they're a part. In the case of agar.io, due to the popularity of the program, there are newer services online making the use of bots available so that players can establish presences in the game whilst doing something else. Services also exist for players to add further visual information to their dots to skin them. Another reading, however, is that to note how much can be done with simple sets of procedures. An algorithm is just one layer of description, but it's key to the pleasures of the game in its relation to process. So Twitch Plays Pokemon is the one that we've got on the screen. This is from the first phase of the game. It's still ongoing. The system is set up by an Australian programmer who established a server with a Nintendo Game Boy emulator and then linked that to an IRC chat, which would be on the far column of the screen, in which people were able to discuss and collaborate on playing the game. What you've got on the left column here is a recording of players giving instructions. There are basically 7 different instructions that you can give whilst playing the game. And what happens is, at the time it started, there were a few hundred people playing it collaboratively. Within a few days, there were around 1.5 million people who played it over the space of about a week. And you had this very interesting conjuncture of a network designed for collaboration in certain ways being used to play a game designed for a single person. And I'll explain that in more detail. So Twitch is a video streaming service largely used by gamers to show live play of esports. Using this system, Twitch Plays Pokemon is a series in which users work via a modification of the system to play an ancient Game Boy game en masse. The series is, at the point of writing, that is last week, still ongoing, having moved through the series of games on Game Boy into those on Nintendo DS. Using Twitch's existing video service, the project uses an IRC bot to read 7 simple commands to feed to the Game Boy emulator, which is called Visual Boy Advance. Given the nature of the game, there's a strong narrative element as different from agar.io, but it's the way in which this is then taken up by the joint processes of playing the game that is remarkable. The project started as a simple social experiment in online collaboration that, whilst in progress, went viral and involved tens of thousands of players simultaneously. Having started on February the 13th, 2014, it took 16 days, 7 hours, 45 minutes and 30 seconds of continuous play to complete Pokemon Red, the first game in the series. Compiling the 7 different commands from tens of thousands of players at first meant that every command was taken in sequence as they were received. This meant that players would often contradict each other, often deliberately, and that the start button might also get pressed at any point. As the game progressed, another mode was introduced by its anonymous developer. This mode, Democracy, took a sample of inputs made within a certain time frame and took the majority decision as to what to do. The decision to enter this mode could be made by players voting during the course of the game. The original mode, now dubbed Anarchy, would be restarted every hour. In the few days that this process was running for the first time, over 1.5 million players took part round the clock. The game spawned numerous memes and social media discussions. It may have also accidentally proven the flexibility and robustness of the Twitch platform, which was sold to Amazon some time later. Adrian Mackenzie has written extensively on the way in which lags, or mixed temporalities, become a material force in online gaming environments. A player may, for instance, be able to use the delay present in a game server or the relaying of information by the network to shoot the avatar of another player before the other knows they're even being shot at. A whole infrastructure of international servers has grown up around ameliorating this problem. Lag is the ghost that haunts cloud computing and the endless rollout of hyperbole about high bandwidth internet. Lag is the experience of time not as universal measure, but as highly specific undergoing of processing. Lag operating differently by different protocols is something that emerges out of the interplay of the material conditions of networks of computers running a stack of different software. Relayed in some software as buffering, where the buffer preempts the event of lag by preloading data. Lag is more difficult to preempt in systems predicated upon liveness, such as games or live interaction between performers, for instance. Twitch Plays Pokemon involved tens of thousands of players operating a black and white game with minimal command input and with a wildly overflowing chat log. It was hugely chaotic, but it also showed algorithmic processes to be something that people amuse themselves in experiencing. Lag here becomes a thickly operative part of the game, an entity that emerges out of the interaction of a multitude of parts. In this condition, simple moves may take hours to complete and may be sabotaged by players acting as trolls or by simple lack of coordination of aims, understanding, timing, operating at multiple scales. Here, process intensity becomes a highly social factor as process is bundled up and networked across the vast crowd of users. In the middle of the mayhem emerges a condition of rule sets as sociability, not one of efficiency, but of the relishing of muddle. Manic futility, the urge to throw oneself into a pointless process, the glorious abundance of nothing in particular, becomes core here. We press buttons together in order to play a childish game on an emulator of an out-of-date equipment running under the faintly absurd mythos of a game running a hugely successful but slightly passé franchise based around the idea of a game in a science fiction future, all of which is run across an advanced planetary communications network to afford maximum redundancy of interaction and the possibly maximal expenditure of processing power, labor, and attention in order to achieve a satisfactorily trivial task. In effect, we have the internet presenting itself as a gleeful parody of the regime of efficiency and collaboration and of digital abundance with which it is so often incorporated. So what can be proposed is that these means are ways of dealing with algorithmic culture as both what we can call ambience and as dose. Ambience, because like and as the office workers bored at work, we're saturated with the temporalities, ordering, and analyses of algorithmic processes. Many of these at the moment are exceptionally low-grade, background operations that provide a texture to contemporary forms of life. Others are highly focused, specific, and singular operations. Others, in turn, are fundamental mechanisms of governance and ordering that make explicit and opaque operations of distinction that are enforced with the brutality of a border. Such conditions also operate as a dose, rather than ambience, in that they enable constituent countermeasures of the break, addiction, supplement, release in and amongst the conditions of such forms of life. One sits in the waiting room of the UK Border Agency's Luna House at Croydon, waiting for a visa interview, playing a game, or doing friendship maintenance data entry work as a means of inhabiting the slow grind of sudden decision with other temporalities, other trivial and pointless operations, since their texture is more amenable to inhabitation and distraction than the operations of the life-size logic gate which one is inhabiting. There is such a condensation of procedure in such a place, such a heaviness of a logic, that to introduce a more minor one is to gain a certain release, even if only by the modulation of one irritation by another. And one way to read this is to suggest that self-constitution can be read as an act of mixing different temporalities, procedures, degrees of focus, and procedural operations. This composition is collective as well as individuating, since such procedures are drawn from and imposed by numerous resources and contexts that operate across persons, organizations, economic regimes, and conditions of information. Each comes with its characteristic degree of echoing, modulation, interference, and other patterns and processes. The interrelation of these procedures as forces is the context for and tonality of an ethos and aesthetics of the creation of dispositions. Dosage can be differentiated from the figure of the pharmacon in the work of Derrida and Stiegler in that it doesn't consist of anything necessarily radically different from what it acts to cure. We're simply talking of a different tempo, intensity, or degree of triviality of process. More fundamentally, the way in which this interaction of dose and ambience implies no substantial difference has some significance from material politics of computing. But we can also say that ambience and dose also operate at a range of scales. Their attraction for models of governmentality and those attempting to hold the condition of a society together, to perpetuate or intensify certain conditions, is related to, via various subterranean and explicit means, to that of those attempting to hang together as a subject, in that they provide an offer of the proper or imaginable ordering of things, and a means by which they can seemingly be handled. More fundamentally, ambience and dose provide the challenge of imagining a composition that has a certain degree of self-consistency to it, at the same time as working on a provisional basis, one that can be thought on the basis of Unix-like systems of patches and pipes, or in terms of interacting chaotic locales, or a technocratic imaginary of order in a duel and a dance with entropy. In such a state, moments of speed and of slackness, dawdling in conditions of which may accelerate or ease down the texture of process intensity, passages of massing, snowballing, drifting, hiding, incoherence, inconsequentiality, collective engorgement and triviality, or the minor pleasures of chasing, being chased, and being devoured come to the fore, what we can call a veritable procedural paradise, approximately speaking. Okay, thank you.